Gateway to Hell by Melinda Kucera, Book 1 of the Rogue Gods Trilogy, Part 3. Chapter 9. Breakfast and Breaking Time. Ivarian woke when a hand squeezed his shoulder. Sunrise painted the sky in soft hues of pink and blue as he tried to separate his dreams of time fracturing like glass from the reality that he was still trapped in that ruined city. Time won't break. Uncle Hithaglir will come around and see reason.
Here, I brought you some bread, 3 soft-boiled eggs, and that cheese you like. It's the one with the holes in it.
Uncle Hithaglir caught his arm and helped him get up from the hard ground.
It's over here, along with that vile stuff you like to drink with breakfast.
His uncle led him to a collapsed column set like a table with plates, cups, and even cutlery. 2 smaller blocks served as seats, and there was indeed a steaming cup of a hot beverage made from a nut that grew all over the enchanted forest in Shaeri. Different parts of the country prepared it differently, but Ivarian didn't care which one his uncle got. The creamy drink was just what he needed to wake up and deal with a trickster god at this ungodly hour. "Why's time messed up here?" Ivarian asked after he drained half the cup of chava. It was nutty and a little slice of comfort in this strange situation.
What are you talking about? It's not messed up here.
Uncle Hithaglir sipped from his canteen. He didn't look like he was hiding anything, but he must be. "I'll show you what I mean after I eat." Ivarian picked up the bread, and some of the yolk dripped out, so the eggs were already between the 2 halves. That would make it messy to eat but faster, and that was good since his uncle didn't come to bring him breakfast. "I'd better eat this before we get into another argument. I need it." His belly cramped with hunger since he missed dinner yesterday, and his mind was still fuzzy from sleep.
What did you see?
Uncle Hithaglir regarded him with hooded eyes from across the makeshift table. Ivarian didn't see any reason not to tell his uncle in between bites, and it might dissuade him from his plans. "I hope he sees reason soon." When he finished his tail and the sandwich, Ivarian reached for the triangle of holy cheese.
Show me where you saw that. I need to see it for myself.
Uncle Hithaglir rose and capped his canteen. Ivarian drained the rest of the shava and grabbed the cheese to nibble along the way. "Sure, it's this way." He led the way to the steps and the broad avenue he followed the night before, but his uncle stopped him halfway there when a sourceless wind blew past them, then vanished again. Figures moved about them like pale shadows on the stones, then disappeared.
I see what you mean. Isn't it glorious? The old days are trying to return on their own.
Uncle Hithaglir grinned and spun on his heel like a dancer as the invisible currents of time flowed past him. His flowing sleeves and long hemlines swirled around him.
Don't you see? Fate is on our side. We can't fail.
His uncle laughed and twirled. "I don't think Aunt Faye is on your side. From what Mom told me about her, she'd never go along with this, and neither would my mom." Ivarian didn't know why his uncle couldn't see that. After God knew how many thousands of years, he should know his sisters by now. Uncle Hithaglir's pale eyes flashed with anger when he faced him.
I could leave you here forever, boy. No one knows where you are right now except me, and you can't teleport.
"You won't do that because Mom would never forgive you. She'd spend the rest of her life making your life miserable if anything happened to me." Ivarian was certain of it, but he clenched his fists because he didn't want to be stuck here alone forever. Mothers weren't supposed to have favorites, but he was the youngest, and he'd almost died as a child. "Mom's pretty protective of me too, even though I'm 20 now, but he didn't mind. Demigods could live for 1,000 years, and they weren't considered adults until they passed their first century. So from her point of view, he was still her baby, and he didn't mind that at all. But one glance at his uncle told him that the man was serious. "Oh God, he would leave me here if I don't comply. How can I do what he wants and not cause more damage to the timeline than whatever he's already done?" Ivarian tried to think of something else he could offer his uncle, except the one thing the man wanted. "Could I fool my uncle into believing I'll take the spell into the past?" Probably not, because his uncle could time walk just as well as he could, and he could just check. So that wouldn't work. "What can I do?" Ivarian hugged himself as he sought a solution to his problem. "I can't hide it. Or could I? What if I hide the spell somewhere he wouldn't look and put a replica in the past where he wants it? That could work, but he'd have to look at the spell and hope it was written in a language that his uncle couldn't read. Then he could screw up the copy and his uncle wouldn't know unless he could read the original script. How can I tell if he can read it without tipping him off to my plan?" Ivarian drew a blank on that.
Will you help me?
Uncle Hithaglir held a scroll out to him. "If I say no, would you really leave me here?" Ivarian studied his uncle, then backed away when he saw the man was serious about that.
I don't want to, but this is too important.
Uncle Hithaglir waved the scroll as he turned slowly to take in the avenue and the crumbling buildings surrounding them.
You're so young. You can't understand what we lost. I wish I could show you, but there's a point in the past that not even I or your mother can walk beyond. So our glory days are truly lost to us. If you could see them, then you would understand everything I'm trying to do. We could make this world a paradise.
The way his mother talked about the old days, things weren't great. When the old gods ruled, there was no paradise. Not for anyone who wasn't them. And that wasn't something Ivarian wanted to help bring back. But he needed to play along, so his uncle didn't leave. "Tell me about those glory days." Ivarian didn't want to ask about them, but if his resolve was really wavering, that would be something he would want to know. Since his entire plan to get out of here hinged on his uncle believing that he was changing his mind. He needed to give his uncle a chance to change it for real. That was easier said than done though. I just want to get out of here. And he was tempted to say whatever his uncle wanted to hear just so the man would teleport him away from here. But promises to the old gods were binding, and he wasn't in the right frame of mind to escape any of the clauses or conditions his uncle could place on him. Not after a night of fitful sleep on the cold stones of the ruined temple, with nothing but the wind whistling through the empty city to keep him company. He shivered in remembrance of that lonely sound.
That's a good question.
But his uncle didn't seem to have an explanation, because he just stared at the hills surrounding the city, as if the answer lay somewhere beyond them. You said in the old days when we ruled, but I've never heard of you ruling anything. Ivarian couldn't help but get that dig in. His uncle was the least likely to rule anything because he was so capricious.
Well, I didn't mean that I ruled, but as a race we were exalted above everyone else. We had certain rights, titles, and properties that other people didn't have.
Uncle Hithaglir tapped the end of the rolled scroll on his palm. So his uncle wanted to go back to a time when he had more stuff. Ivarian wondered if his uncle even remembered the glory days because this didn't sound like something to bring back. Unfortunately, the man still didn't give him a reason to change his mind and move his conversation along to the teleport out of here part of the plan. When I get back, I'm going straight to Mom and telling her what her brother is up to. Let her deal with him. She had the power, and he was her twin brother, so that made her kind of responsible. Besides, this had gotten way out of hand, and Ivarian was glad he wouldn't be considered an adult in the old days, because this wasn't a situation he wanted to handle ever again.
We were worshipped. You don't know what that's like until you've lost it.
Uncle Hithaglir sighed and strode back to the ruined temple. Well, that was something. But Ivarian didn't want to be worshipped for any reason. He liked living in anonymity. But he had to make his conversion sound good, so he should play along. What was it like to be worshipped? Ivarian hurried after him and hoped he looked interested, not appalled at the idea of anyone worshipping his uncle. Uncle Hithaglir had a big enough ego without that.
It's like power pouring into you from an unending fountain of worshippers. All they have to do is think of you.
Uncle Hithaglir snapped his fingers to show how easy it was to get power from these long-dead worshippers. You're right, I can't imagine what that's like, and he didn't want to try. Ivarian searched for something else to say.
Don't you want to find out?
His uncle waved to the temple in front of them.
Don't you want a temple built in your honor?
Now that it came to it, could he fake enough interest to convince his uncle that his ridiculous reasoning was changing his mind? Ivarian had never been much for acting, but he needed to put on a performance of a lifetime. I do, but I don't want to hurt anyone, and what you ask could hurt people. There, that sounded reasonable.
Oh, you won't hurt anyone. In fact, you'll help everyone. People need someone to worship. They need to believe. That's what's wrong with this world nowadays. No one believes in anything anymore.
Uncle Hithaglir climbed the cracked steps to the platform the temple stood on. How will you convince them to worship you? Ivarian tried really hard to keep a straight face. That couldn't possibly be his uncle's end goal. If his uncle wanted a cult, he could just start one. There were always people looking to believe in something. There was no need to call forth all the other ex-gods to get that.
It starts with that summoning spell. We need to create the right conditions for a new religion to take hold, and for that, we need a brief period of chaos.
Uncle Hithaglir waved the scroll about like it was a magic wand, and maybe to him it was. You want to summon all the other ex-gods to create this chaos? Ivarian couldn't possibly have heard that right.
Well, not all of them. Just the ones most likely to go crazy and start trouble.
His uncle ran up the last few steps and surveyed the ruined city like he owned the place.
Will you help me? Don't worry about your mother. She'll understand. After all, she's my twin, and I know she needs this just as much as I do.
Ivarian didn't believe that for a moment. His mother preferred to live in secrecy and pretend to be human. She called it her retirement. She wouldn't want any of this. Ivarian was as certain of that as he was of his own name.
Will you help me?
Uncle Hithaglir held the scroll out to him. This was the moment of truth. Do I run up the steps and take it from his hand, or do I tell him he's nuts, and I won't help him? Ivarian knew which one would get what he wanted, so he stepped on the bottom step, right on the crack that split it in half, and that was fitting because it felt like his life was split in half too. There was before this and after, and only time would tell what trouble would come from this decision. But I just want to go home. Surely no one can fault me for that. Still, Ivarian hesitated. Uncle Hithaglir sighed.
I didn't want to bring this up, but you need to know. So it falls to me to tell you what your mother won't.
What are you talking about? Ivarian stared at him. What would Mom not tell me? According to the laws in Shayari, where he lived, he could marry and own property next year when he turned 21.
Your mother and I, we look human, but we're not.
I know that. Mom had told him what being an ex-god entailed, although not much of it impinged on his life since he was half human.
We need believers. Without them, we fade away.
Uncle Hithaglir held out his other hand. Ivarian drew back in horror when he could look through it at the sky above them.
Your mother will fade away too soon. We all will. The time of the old gods ended a long time ago, and we held on because we still had believers in the old ways, but they're gone now. No one believes in us anymore.
Uncle Hithaglir lowered his transparent hand until the long sleeves of his overly decorated robe covered it again.
With your help, We can restore those days and save your mother and me. Will you help me?
There must be another way to save his mom, but Ivarian couldn't think of it.
If you have the spell, then your uncle can't use it.
Someone whispered, or maybe Ivarian imagined that since there was no one else here except for the two of them. But that voice was right. If I have the spell, then I can prevent anyone from using it. Ivarian hurried up the steps and took the spell from his uncle's hands and unrolled it. What do you need me to do?
Go back in time. About 16 years should do it. That's when the fading started. Find someone to use the spell.
Unfortunately, the spell was written in modern Shayaran, and his uncle could definitely read that. Damn. There went all hope of copying it and messing up the copy. Ivarian didn't want to ask, but he needed to know. Who do we summon?
My cousin, the ex-god of war, of course. When you need chaos, he's the best there is at unleashing it.
Uncle Hithaglir laughed as if he just told a joke, but there was nothing funny about any of this. Where do I find someone who can use the spell? Ivarian hoped there was no such person. Magic was illegal in Shayari and had been so for centuries, so there weren't likely to be many mages roaming around. His uncle squeezed his shoulder.
I don't know. You'll have to figure that out yourself.
Can I go home first? I'll need some things for the journey. This sounded more and more like an impossible quest. At least in the great stories, the hero had help along the way. I'll be lucky if I can get some food and water for the road.
All right, let's go.
Uncle Hithaglir's silver eyes glowed as white light surrounded them. Ivarian clutched the scroll, torn between destroying it and following through with his deception. But he didn't chuck the spell out of the radius of his uncle's teleportation spell. White light blinded him as the world slid sideways. I hope you're home, Mom. I could really use your help with this.
Chapter 10. Many Meetings. Rosalie adjusted her rucksack as she hiked through the enchanted forest. Sunlight dappled the leaf mold and gilded the giant trees she passed. Somewhere ahead, Mount Eredren stood, and that was her goal. I'll show them all what a determined woman can do. Rosalie held her head high as she trod on through the golden afternoon. The sunlight flickered, and the enchanted trees around her bent, as if struck by an invisible force. The sky darkened as clouds covered it. All around her, short black and gray threads fell like rain, but this wasn't a natural weather phenomenon. As the threads covered the ground, it turned gray, and the grass and other plants withered away. What's happening? Rosalie pulled her hood up to shield her head, and she pulled her hands into her sleeves. Now all her bare skin was covered. She could run, but where should she run to? Mount Eredren was still at least 3 miles away, maybe more if her calculations were correct. A shadow passed her, and she felt cold all over. But that didn't make sense, because it was summer now, and quite warm before thick clouds rolled in.
I just want it to be beautiful,
someone with a raspy voice said, but when she turned to glance behind her, no one was there. Am I losing my mind? Rosalie didn't think so, but how would she know? A giant stone statue of a man appeared in front of her. Where did this come from? The statue towered over her, and its glowing green eyes seemed to look right through her. What the hell is going on? Images flashed through her mind of humanoid creatures crashing through the forest. Horns protruded from their heads, and they towered over her too. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly fire as they charged toward her, holding wickedly sharp axes in their clawed hands. Their footsteps were a thunderous din that shook the ground as she ran. The forest will save me. She repeated their 3 rules like a mantra against the fear constricting her chest. Start no fires, carry no weapons, do no harm, follow the rules and live. And she was following them. The trees would save her. She just needed to give them time to wake up and defend her.
Rosalie, where are you?
Her mother yelled from somewhere nearby. Mom, I'm over here. Relief swept through her. Mom was a warrior and often away doing warrior things. But Mom was back now right when she needed her. Mom?
I'm coming.
The earth trembled as the trees uprooted themselves and stabbed at the creatures behind her. The blue and gray horned creatures roared as the trees lashed out with their branches and raised their roots to trip them. The forest filled with the thud of axes striking wood, but that just made the trees angrier.
What are you doing out here? You know you're not supposed to go into the forest alone.
Mom ran up to her, holding a crossbow in one hand. She extended her other hand to catch her arm. Even she towered over Rosalie, until she fell with an axe buried in her back. No, Mom, Rosalie screamed as the world turned black.
Are you all right?
A man asked as he shook her shoulder gently. Rosalie opened her eyes and stared into the green eyes of a handsome stranger. A statue stood behind him. The images of her mother lying dead at her feet momentarily overtook her sight, but she shook them away. That wasn't real. Mom's just fine. I argued with her 3 days ago. She's fine. But the image felt like a memory. But it wasn't a memory, because Mom always wore that red brigade everywhere. She never took it off, but she wasn't wearing it in that image. It wasn't real. Mom is fine and mad at me as usual.
Are you okay? You're just staring at me. I'm a good-looking guy, but it's rude to stare.
He preened a little at the attention, and maybe it was the angle or the lighting since the sun returned during her blackout, but he looked exactly like the statue. You look like the statue behind you. Was he a relative? Rosalie sat up. The threads were gone too, like they never covered everything. What happened? Did I hallucinate everything? She felt weird, but not enough to account for it. His smile fell and his gaze too.
He was my father, but he died 16 years ago when I was just a kid who thought adults were weird.
I'm sorry for your loss. And I'm still being rude. I'm Rosalie. What's your name?
I'm just called Ran.
He rose and he was quite tall, probably taller than her by a lot.
Do you need a hand up?
Thanks. She accepted his hand, and he pulled her to her feet. Just as she suspected, he was a lot taller than her. The top of her head was level with his shoulder. Oh well, she was never the tallest woman in the room. What are you doing out here?
I came to visit his grave. He died here.
Ran let go of her hand and faced the statue. She almost asked if he was sure the statue wasn't of him. The resemblance was uncanny, but sadness weighed his shoulders down as he bowed his head. Then he crouched and placed a white stone at the statue's feet.
I miss you, Dad. I wish I could bring you back.
Ran rose and wiped his eyes. Rosalie felt like a voyeur, but she was still a bit out of sorts, and she couldn't get that image of her mother or those creatures out of her mind. How did he die?
A demon killed him. I don't remember if that was before they invaded or after. I wasn't paying attention to much then.
What demon invasion? Rosalie staggered away from him as the images of those horned creatures with axes blotted out the world again. She felt faint. Those images couldn't be real. That didn't happen. The world blackened for a second time as she repeated that over and over like a talisman. But it happened, a voice said as the memory of that stupid argument she had with her mother only days ago faded away like it never happened.
Rosalie, are you okay?
Ran asked as she sank to the ground and closed her eyes. When she opened them, ash covered the ground in her too. The enchanted trees were gray, and they bent away from this spot like something pushed them aside. She touched the ashes and tiny strings wriggled away from her fingers. The forest was just green and growing, but now it was gray and lifeless. But Rand didn't seem to notice. He just brushed the ash from his dark clothes and hair like this was normal when it certainly wasn't.
No, oh God, no.
A man shouted, and he sounded close by. I will be okay. Come on, someone's in trouble. Rosalie pushed to her feet and shoved those images away. She could sort out what they were and why she was seeing them later.
Are you sure you're okay? Because I can check on him without you.
Rand waved toward the shout. I'm fine. Rosalie straightened her skirt and squared her shoulders as she marched between the dead trees. I don't need any coddling, especially not from a stranger.
All right, if you pass out again, I'm not carrying you.
Rand outpaced her easily with his longer strides. That's fine. I didn't ask you to carry me. My legs work just fine. Rosalie clenched her fists. She was so tired of men assuming she was a weakling, because she liked dresses and feminine things. I can be pretty and strong at the same time. The two aren't mutually exclusive, but her mother thought they were. Well, Mom grew up in a different time when women had no rights. She had no choice but to shove her way into a man's world to make a living, but I walk a different path.
Chapter 11. Not where I thought. Ivarian staggered as the white light faded, leaving him standing in a gray place where giant trees bent away from each other, like something large shoved them aside. Gray light lit the ground, and a thin layer of ashes covered it. Where are we? Ivarian turned slowly, taking it all in. Clearly his uncle was still playing tricks on him, because this wasn't home. The devastation spread as far as he could see, only a lone mountains untouched. Its crooked cone stood a few miles away, but he didn't recognize it.
I don't understand it. They said this was the way to fix everything.
Uncle Hithaglir staggered toward a bent tree that was as gray as the sky, and he faded more with each step. What's happening to you? Ivarian stumbled toward him, but his uncle disintegrated into a pile of ashes and blew away on the breeze before he reached him. No, oh God, no. Ivarian dropped to his knees in the ashes as images assaulted him of things that had never happened. But they were so real, and the images cut through his mind as they played out. The sky darkened as a bright light blinded him. He gripped the basket of berries in his hand as large, growling man-shaped creatures with horns and claws charged through the light. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly fire as they swung their axes. Ivarian froze and stared at them. He didn't know what to do. The enchanted trees woke up and thrashed about, impaling the creatures on their branches. But more kept coming through the bright light. It must be some kind of portal. Someone must come and stop this.
Ivarian.
Mom yelled, then strong arms wrapped around him and lifted him. He hugged her as she ran from the snarling creatures, but every step away made her feel less solid until he dropped from her arms. Mom, what's happening? His mother stared at her hands as they faded away.
I think this is the end of me. Tell your father and your sisters that I love them more than I can ever say. And I love you too, my miracle child.
Then she knelt and tried to hug him one more time before she disintegrated into a pile of ashes at his feet. Istiana, the former goddess of the past, was no more. No, oh God, no. Ivarian screamed as the images faded and his world turned black. But that reprieve was short-lived.
Hey, are you okay?
A man asked.
We heard you shout, and if we heard it, then any demons who are about probably heard it too. So you should head to Mount Eredrin and finish freaking out there where it's safe.
Who are you? Ivarian opened his eyes and glared at the green-eyed man, who pointed toward a crooked mountain in the distance. He was probably around the same age as him.
Surely you can give him a moment to come to his senses. What demons?
A woman asked, but she froze as if just asking unlocked something in her mind. She covered her mouth and sank to her knees as her skirt pulled around her. Are you all right? Ivarian sat up and reached for her hand. She looked as shaken as he felt. She shook her head.
No, but I will be. I just need to sort out a few things.
She smiled and glanced away, but it looked forced for politeness' sake because it didn't reach her hazel eyes.
We should go. We've been here too long,
said the impatient man who came with her. I'm Ivarian. Who are you? Ivarian really wanted to know the woman's name, not her companion's name. He admired her self-possession because it reminded him of his mother.
I'm Rosalie.
She accepted his hand when he offered it, and they shook.
You can call me Rand as long as you get up and follow me right now. It's not safe to be out here.
Rand waved to the mountain, standing tall and proud amid the gray, broken landscape.
We'd better do as he says.
Rosalie let go of his hand, and he felt lost for a moment without the warm press of her skin on his. But duty called, so he got shakily to his feet and offered her a hand up. She accepted it with a smile and allowed him to help her rise. But he had another problem. I have no money to pay for accommodations. I left home in a hurry. Ivarian glanced at his scuffed boots. Damn, his uncle for spiriting him off without anything but the clothes on his back. That felt like it happened a lifetime ago instead of yesterday. The memory was fading the more time passed since then, and he wondered if he would forget what happened soon. What about the spell? I was holding it when we teleported, but he wasn't holding anything now. Ivarian glanced at the surrounding ground while his heart pounded in fear. I wish I never accepted that spell. But he did, so now he was responsible for it. It must be here somewhere. Ivarian crouched and ran his hands through the ashes as he searched for it.
What are you doing? We need to leave now.
Rand folded his arms and tapped his foot.
Can't you see he lost something important? Stop standing around giving orders and help him find it.
Rosalie crouched too.
What are you looking for? The search will go faster with two looking than one.
Should I tell her? Ivarian met her gaze and something inside him softened. After all, he needed to tell someone about the spell. That was the only thing he was certain of anymore. I dropped a scroll when I passed out. I must find it.
Then we'll all search for it.
Rosalie glared at Rand over her shoulder. Rand sighed like a frustrated parent.
What kind of scroll was it? If you tell me, then I can save us all a lot of time.
How? Ivarian looked at Rand and noticed the aura of magic surrounding him. You're a mage, aren't you?
Kind of. Look, what I am isn't important. What I can do is, and I can find your scroll fast. I just need to know what it looked like and what it contained.
Rand unfolded his arms and stuffed his hands into his trouser pockets. Ivarian froze. Should he tell them about the spell written on the scroll? How else can I fix things if I don't? The images of his uncle and his mother disintegrating filled his mind and broke his heart.
How can you find it?
Rosalie rose and faced him.
Do you know a finding spell?
I can just wish for it, and it'll appear like magic.
Rand snapped his fingers, then shrugged like that was no big deal. It was this long. Ivarian held his hands about a foot apart. There was a summoning spell written on it in the language we're speaking now.
Could you recognize it if you saw it?
Rand pulled a pale stone out of his pocket, and it glowed white. I think so. I only glanced at it after my uncle gave it to me. Ivarian blinked away a tear. Was his uncle really gone forever?
Then wish for it.
Rand tossed the glowing stone. I don't understand. Ivarian caught it, and his hand tingled from the magic in the rock.
Close your eyes and picture the scroll, then wish for it.
Rand shrugged. I just need to wish for it. Ivarian couldn't believe it was that simple.
That's what I just said. It's not complicated.
What if I wished that spell back to wherever it came from? Would that fix everything? Ivarian didn't know. There was a pit of sadness inside him and memories of an invasion that wasn't his. But the longer he stood there, the more real they felt. Other memories formed of years spent running and hiding with his human father and the deaths of his older sisters. Ivarian squeezed his eyes closed. That didn't happen. I lived a happy, boring, normal childhood in a branch or village with my mom, my sisters, and my father, where nothing ever happened. But those memories were disintegrating like they'd never happened. He couldn't recall the name of his village anymore or any of his childhood friends. Time flowed past him in jagged lines. What did you do, Uncle Hithaglir? Ivarian had a feeling he would need the summoning spell to find out. So he pictured the lines that stood out in memory. Name of God, I call you. The circle binds you to this time and place. You must come. The rock shook on his palm, then expanded and became a roll of parchment longer than his hand. Ivarian opened his eyes and unrolled the scroll to reveal the same spell he glanced at earlier in the ruined city. He rolled it up and blinked away tears. Thank you.
You're welcome. Now come on, we better go to Mount Eredrin. You'll be safe there.
Rand turned to go. Will we be safe there? Ivarian asked. He wasn't looking forward to running into a demon until he learned what their weaknesses were.
Yes, there are protections in place that keep the demons out.
Rand bowed his head as he strode through the bent trees and the ashes kicked up by his boots.
My father made them, but they answer to me now.
Ivarian squeezed the scroll as he followed. Rosalie walked beside him, but neither of them said anything as they passed the statue of a man with glowing crystal eyes who looked like Ran. I will figure out what my uncle did to screw up the timeline, and I'll fix it. Ivarian vowed as the statue faded into the devastation.
Chapter 12. Plotting in Hell. Arginil landed on the spire after that ex-godling vanished inside, accompanied by several guards. The fool probably tried to escape shortly after that, but that was somebody else's problem. Arginil didn't run the spire, and he didn't want to. If he didn't go inside, then he never had to deal with any of its problems, and that was just fine with him. That ex-godling might be gone from his sight, but that fool's words rang in his ears.
Why don't you get your friends together and figure out how to take it back? I'm sure you have minions in the mortal world who could fetch it for you.
Do we have minions there? Arginil pondered this as he stood on top of the spire, high above a desolate plain. The mortal world didn't interest him after the fall, because there was a magical shield over hell that let no one escape, but souls could still enter. After the fall, he devoted his time to collecting all the knowledge down here in one place. If there was a way to break the shield over hell and go back to heaven, then he would find it. Let the rest of his kind fight each other for scraps of power. He had better things to do with his unlimited free time. Arginil paced the narrow top of the spire. The circular roof was only 10 paces wide in between the 6 large metal spikes rising from each of the cardinal points, giving the top of the skyscraper a crown-like look.
What vexes you?
Asked the shadow falling over him. Arginil glanced up at a winged hell beast that kind of looked like a spiky dragon if he squinted at it. Do we have minions in the mortal world? He didn't know if this dread beast would know, but it couldn't hurt to ask since it was circling overhead.
We probably do. Humans need to believe in something, and there's always someone dumb enough to believe in ultimate evil. Some even think they'll earn a boon if they do our bidding.
The dread beast laughed, and the backwash of his wings nearly knocked him off the roof. Arginil grabbed a spike to hang on even though a fall from this height wouldn't kill him. Nothing could. Angels didn't die. They had no souls to go anywhere. They just went on forever without end, either in heaven or in hell. Could we get a message to them? Arginil didn't think a cult would be all that effective in this situation. If they knew about the Book of Names, they might try to use it for their own ends.
There are ways depending on what you need. Come, fly with me. We should speak of these matters where the air is thinner and fewer ears can overhear us.
The dread beast flew away from the spire, but not so quickly that he couldn't catch up. Arginil dove off the spire, and his wings snapped out to catch one of the many thermals that blew around the spire. He rode it into the sky, then flapped his wings to break away from it and follow the dread beast towards the mountains.
What do you need from the mortal world?
The dread beast asked when he closed the distance and conversation became possible again. Someone stole a book from the Library of Forbidden Knowledge, and I need to get it back, but I can't leave hell, and that bothered Arginil. He missed the days when he could go to any of the 12 realms whenever he chose. At least I still have my wings. Many of his brethren lost them in the fall, but he saw the way things were going before anyone else did, so he was one of the first to fall, and that let him control his fall enough to dodge the lightning that followed and save his wings.
This information would be dangerous if it fell into a mortal's hands, correct?
The dread beast glanced at him out of the corner of its massive red eye. Yes, I need to get it back before that happens, or they could summon some prisoners down here. That must be why this Hithaglir took the Book of Names. Arginil couldn't think of any other uses it would have. True names were only useful in a handful of scenarios, but summoning was one of them.
Then I might know someone who can help. Come, fly with me to the edge of this realm.
The dread beast pointed up with its claws. What will that do? You're just as barred from leaving this place as I am. Arginil didn't see anything above them worth flying to, just an expanse of orange sky.
True, but there are thin spots in the shield and through one of them we can whisper.
The dread beast flapped its great wings and flew upward. If he wanted to talk, then he better follow. Arginil sighed, then flapped his wings and angled upward. How do we know if your friend is waiting on the other side?
Oh, my friends will be. They've long sought an ally down here.
The dread beast grinned, a mouthful of sharp, pointy teeth, and each one was as long as his hand. Why haven't you approached anyone else about this? Arginil couldn't believe he was the first or even the only one the dread beast told about his friends.
Because I needed someone who could fly and someone whose need was great enough that they would trust me.
The dread beast gasped as the air thinned. Are you planning to turn on me? If the dread beast did that, he would just fly away. Arginil was one of the best flyers amongst the archangels before the fall. There was no one down here who could best him in flight. The dread beast laughed like he just told a funny joke.
Me turn on you? How would I do that when you're more powerful than I am?
That was also true. As an archangel, he was second only to the power of the one true God. Technically, there was one former archangel who was more powerful than him, but the morning star had long ago turned down a whole different path and embraced his identity as the adversary, and that had changed him so much that he was no longer anything like Arginil. Arginil flew upward through the burnt orange sky until the color lightened, then turned gray. The air was so thin here that each breath gave no relief, But he wasn't alive and didn't actually need to breathe except to talk, so the choking sensation was annoying, but that was it.
We're here,
Said the dread beast with great difficulty. It had to take a breath to force out each word, but that was all the effect the thinner air had on it. They didn't even need to flap their wings all that hard. The air was so thin here that they seemed to weigh nothing at all. Gravity had only the most tenuous of grips on them, and it felt like it might snap if they could just fly a little higher. Of course they couldn't because the barrier stood between them and what used to be a starry black void. The shield was a thin gray line to his sight, but he heard it look different depending on one's magical abilities. How do we reach your friends? Arginil didn't want to stay here any longer than necessary.
They're already there waiting like I promised. Just tell them what you need.
The dread beast gasped as it pointed at the shield.
We know what you need,
Said a buzzing voice unlike any he heard before. How do you know that? Arginil froze and gravity tugged him downward until he flapped his wings.
We know what they took, and we know who took it. Do you want it back?
Yes, of course. Anything that comes to the library of forbidden knowledge is mine, and it must never leave it. Arginil clenched his fists.
Then we'll help you take it back.
How can I get it back? I can't leave hell. The creatures he was talking to must be in the gray between, because that realm lay between heaven and hell, but anything in that realm would have a hard time leaving it. Only angels could leave the gray between and travel to the mortal world, but none of them would help him. Not after he turned against their creator.
We'll help you leave here so you can take back what you lost.
How would that even be possible? Arginil banged on the shield, and it was solid enough to repel him.
How do you think? A portal will open, and you'll stride into the mortal world and take back what you lost.
That's impossible. No one except the creator could set up a portal that tunneled through the gray between to connect hell to the mortal world. It was impossible. Arginil should turn around and fly back to the library right now and forget the book he lost, except he couldn't let it go. This is a waste of time.
No, it's not. We have friends who will help us do this. Return in 3 days and you shall have your portal.
I don't believe it. Arginil dove toward the ground and gravity grabbed hold of him, speeding his fall. But he was still the one in control, so he pulled out of the dive a man length from the ground and flew parallel to it.
Then return in 3 days and see if they're telling the truth.
The dread beast said as its shadow fell over him again. Do you actually believe them? Arginil swung upward and flew toward the beast to make communication easier. He didn't want the creature to shout their business all over hell.
They're not giving me a reason to disbelieve them. Shouldn't you think about what to do if they succeed?
The dread beast raised a ridged brow. What are you talking about? Arginil dropped a few feet until he recovered from his surprise and flapped his wings.
What will you do if they create a portal to the mortal world? Will you enter it alone? Or will you gather an army and do what the adversary couldn't and conquer the mortal world?
The dread beast eyed him curiously. Arginil stopped himself from saying that he didn't know what he would do, because now that the idea was out there, he couldn't escape the visions of glory dancing in his head. No one in the mortal world could challenge him. Even a human mage would be no threat to him. Could I conquer it? Do I want to conquer it? Or would it be better to just leave the portal open and let others pass through to see what happens? That sounded like a saner plan. After all, he didn't survive with his wings and most of his power intact for this long because he was stupid. If they opened a portal to the mortal world, he would find expendable creatures to send through in a series of feints to test the defenses of those on the other side and the reaction from heaven. Surely the Creator and his sycophant angels would come down in mass and stop him. Yes, he would find low-level demons. If the portal appeared, he would send them through and sit like a spider in his web and wait and see what came of it.
You've been listening to Part 3 of Gateway to Hell, Book 1 of the Rogue Gods Trilogy, by Melinda Kucera. Subscribe to the channel so you'll be notified when the next part publishes. The Rogue Gods Trilogy is available as an ebook and paperback and soon a full-cast audiobook. Click the link in the description to order your copy. If you love the Rogue Gods Trilogy, then you'll love Melinda's other epic fantasy adventure books too. They're just as full of magic and mayhem and characters who will do anything to achieve their goals. Check them out at the link in the description, and while you're there, sign up for her newsletter so her characters can talk directly to you. Thank you for listening.